I find it exciting that when somebody comes in and they are really excited about getting a chance to get out and climb one of the mountains that I've climbed or backpack in an area that I've backpacked, and they're looking for the right piece of equipment to get out there and do it. There are times when I've been researching things on the internet and I get overwhelmed, and sometimes it's just nice to sit down and talk with one person one-on-one. That's why I think that customers come to us, is because we are local, and the gear that we carry is the gear that we ourselves like to use. So if you hike, climb, or ski in the Pacific Northwest, it'd be awesome to have you come in here so we can get you all geared up to get outside.
We want to thank everyone for their participation in the panel and providing our community with more resources to participate in a more anti-racist backcountry. Our last speaker this evening is Laura Maguire. Laura is a researcher at the Cognitive Systems Engineering Lab at The Ohio State University, where she studies human performance in high risk and high consequence work in fields such as healthcare, space operations, military and disaster recovery, and critical digital infrastructure. Her research interests lie in studying real work in the natural laboratory of mountain environments and understanding the adaptation and resilience needed for working in conditions of uncertainty and change. She has a master's degree in human factors and system safety and a PhD in cognitive systems and engineering. Drawing from 15 years of experience working in safety and risk management, she has published multiple topics for avalanche forecasting and mountain safety and presented internationally on her research. The challenges that the wicked environment of the mountains can bring with little or delayed feedback is well documented, and yet still so challenging for recreationists and professionals alike to overcome. I'm excited to hear from this talk what other industries have learned from coping with complexity and uncertainty in high risk and high consequence environments, and how we can apply those insights to our own travel in the mountains. Laura, thanks for being here this evening.
All right, thanks so much, Charlotte, and thanks to everyone who's here tonight and who is still sticking around. As always, I'm very stoked to get to share some of my research with you. And what I'm going to talk about tonight is accumulation of about the last 20 years of my life, where I've sort of straddled this line between my personal world, where I started out in the ski industry and I spent a lot of time in the mountains, and later in my professional life, where I became a safety and a risk management professional in working in a lot of high risk and high consequence type domains. And the more that I worked in these domains, the more uncomfortable I got with the kinds of stories that got told about how it is that people stay safe when they're working on the edge of catastrophic failure. Because I spent a lot of time as a safety professional, making sure everyone was wearing their non-slip footwear and conducting audits on paperwork that shows that things are safe, even while those on the front lines of the operations were expressing worries about how do we get the job done on time when there's a key piece of equipment that's gone down and there's no money in the budget to repair it, or how are we going to handle a big project if we're working with a crew of experienced workers. And these were not outlier type events. They were really commonplace, and they're largely absent. These problems are largely absent from the stories that get told. So instead of safety glasses and rule compliance, the real stories about safety are about people trying to do really hard things in a world that's always changing, and it's throwing up new and unexpected events that have to be dealt with in real time. And so as Charlotte mentioned, I've spent the last 8 years of my life in the academic world, studying how it is that people cope with complexity, with uncertainty, with surprise, and with this constant need to be adaptive, all while they're trying to accomplish goals and priorities. And so tonight we're going to talk about the parallels to staying safe in avalanche terrain, whether you're a lead forecaster at a ski resort, and this year more than half of your control team has never handled explosives, or whether you're out touring and someone in your group's binding breaks 2 hours out from the car. So truthfully, in this story, or in this talk, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take us a little bit out of bounds. We're going to venture into some terrain that might be kind of new for some of you. And in doing so, my hope is that we start talking about where the boundary is today, about how we're thinking about safety, how we're thinking about risk management, and how we might move that out. Because how the ski community currently talks about error, about what we call human performance, and about staying safe in avalanche terrain is actually decades behind where the progressive safety science is at. So before I get too deep into it, let's take a little look at what is the science, what is behind this. And so cognitive systems engineering is really just a fancy way of saying that we take a really close look at how people work in the real world. Not in a laboratory, not in theory, but in these real, messy, noisy, distracting worlds. And typically we study expertise in domains like space exploration, like emergency medicine, military aviation. And we study those jobs with the kinds of techniques and methods that not only helps us say, okay, here's how you train an astronaut. Here's how you coordinate surgical teams. Here's how you design more functional cockpits for fighter pilots. But it also helps us understand how do you support expert performance in very complex dynamic environments where risk profiles are always changing, they're always shifting, and where getting surprised can get people killed. And so these are some of the principles and the frameworks that I'm going to share with you today to give you a little bit of insight into how we can actually use this knowledge to think differently about working or recreating in high risk, high consequence mountain environments. So we're going to cover a lot of ground. So I want to share this plan with you. And just as you would dig a snow pit to kind of reveal some of the multiple layers in the snowpack, we're going to go really deep into cognition of how it is that we interpret the environment around us. And while I'm going to point out some strategies along the way, this isn't going to be a how-to talk. I know it's late, but we're going to talk a lot about how we need to shift how we think about the world so that we can shift how we act and how we talk with our group, our peers. So here's where we're going. I'm not pulling any punches. Right out of the gate, we're going to talk about how human factors is not just about heuristics and biases. We're going to cover some remarkably sophisticated things that your brain is actually doing to help you navigate risk in the backcountry. And then we're going to kind of continue that traverse and explore what it means to perform well under conditions of uncertainty, time pressure, ambiguity. And this is going to lead us into some familiar terrain where we can look at this from this new vantage point. So we'll talk about being prepared to face uncertainty by emphasizing this continual calibration, not necessarily complete knowledge. And then on our descent, I'm going to show you a way for us to kind of double down on improving safety by studying how things go right. And Steve, I love that I saw this in your presentation as well. So we must be doing something right here on Tuesday evening. And so hopefully we're going to end with what we in the business call applause. And these 5 constructs are what represent a new view for safety. This is the edge of safety research as it stands today. And a nice kind of shortcut for us to think about how this works is there's 2 parts of this equation. Typically in safety management, we focused on reducing errors. And what we want to kind of shift this conversation is to thinking about how do we start generating insights to be able to help people support people to adapt and anticipate when things are going to change. So here's the punchline. Human factors is not just about heuristics and biases. And I know we've heard a lot about this over the last couple of days, but my issue with this framing is that it's actually an oversimplification of some really quite incredible human capabilities that we are going to talk about next. But also that it has dominated the discussion of error in ways that's kind of stunted curiosity about what are other possible reasons why accidents happen. Because it orients us to ask from a position of incredulousness, why would they do that? And instead of approaching an accident or a near miss from a place of inquiry and saying, now, why would they have done that? So that we can shift perspective and we can look at the world as those people saw it in a way that made sense to them to take that actions in the moment. And it's not just the backcountry community that should be questioning the value of defining human factors only as heuristics and biases. In fact, there is a total safety nerd street fight going on right now about this very thing. And it kind of revolves around these two camps that come from very different assumptions about how people work and how people operate in very changing worlds. And so this is really important for you as a member of this community and for someone who might be using these terms to describe the experiences that you or others are having. So let's break this down a little bit. The first camp over here says that humans are kind of flawed and they're prone to making mistakes. They have biased thinking. Heuristics are traps. They're flawed ways of thinking, which is kind of a partial and incomplete representation of heuristics, but that's something to talk about in the question and answer. And so when you have accidents on this side of this camp, they sort of respond by shaming and blaming those that get involved, and often by just saying, well, they just need to be retrained. They obviously didn't understand what was going on. And so that in and of itself, the retraining is not necessarily a bad thing. But if you haven't taken the time to fully appreciate the full context around how those decisions got made, you likely won't actually be training the right things. Another problem with this camp is that the shame and blame actually drives reporting of near misses underground, and it shuts down opportunities for learning. You kind of create this culture where people hide their near misses, or worse, when they hear about someone else's near misses, they exhibit what we call distancing through differencing. And so rather than listening to other people's stories or accident reports or near misses and trying to place themselves into the skin track, right into the moments before things went wrong and thinking, how might these choices looked like safe ones to make? How might I have actually done the same thing if I was in this context? They might instead find ways in which they never would have done that thing. And when you do that, you leave behind this important opportunity for learning. So this worldview largely underpins how we've been talking about human factors in the avalanche safety for almost the last 20 years. And I'm kind of from the other camp. And this other camp talks about, as Steve mentioned a little bit this morning, earlier this evening, is that people actually cope with complexity. They manage change remarkably well, and they make a lot of trade-offs as they're navigating these kind of wild environments. And so we need to look more broadly at the context in which those decisions get made, the challenges of what available data was there, the difficulties of being able to bring knowledge to bear in context, and the kinds of resources or choices that were available, or more specifically, sometimes not available, to be able to see the actual possibilities for action before we can start judging decision-making and reasoning. And so on my side, our reaction to failure is that this is an opportunity to learn. It's an opportunity to uncover how things go right, much more than they actually go wrong. And so my side says that in order to pass judgment about actions and decisions that are taken in the field, you actually have to put yourself into the boots on the skin track, and you have to appreciate the context in which the decisions got made. All of this so that we can better aid the ability of folks to anticipate and adapt in real time as conditions change. So moving past heuristics and biases towards trying to understand more of the context of understanding decisions is really important for us as a community. It's kind of attractive to stick with this heuristics and biases label because it defines this complex phenomenon in a really simple way. And oftentimes in the traumatic and the grief-stricken aftermath of an accident, we just want answers. And we want to make sense of deeply disturbing events so that we can find reasons to go back out there. And finding fault with individual actions or decisions is actually easier than confronting that chronic unease that there can be a lot of uncertainty about safe travel in the backcountry. So this is a great time to move on to point number 2, which is offering an alternative to talking about heuristics and biases. And this is by considering cognitive processes. So remember I said we were going to start digging the snowpack? Here we are, we're about to go deep. So cognitive work is about the impressive perceptual capabilities that we have to perceive often very subtle cues from the world around us. It's the ability to direct attention to what's meaningful and important. It's the ability to store and recall, or store knowledge and recall events and experiences that can help us make sense of things as we move forward. And it's the process of reasoning about ambiguities and complexities in the problems that we're facing. And all of that is, how does that reasoning result in decision making? How do we handle goal conflicts? Like if you're a guide, how do you keep clients happy who've been paid to be out heli skiing while you're also staying within your safety margin? It's also about, how do we manage trade-offs of operating in dangerous environments? Do you cross a ridge as weather's coming in to save the energy of the group? Or do you descend and you incur a much longer day? These are the realities of the environments that we operate in. So, as I said, perception is about noticing and receiving data about the state of the world. And these capabilities are, of course, our five senses. They can be visual, they can be auditory, they can be tactile. You can see cracking, you can hear wumping, you can probe snow crystals, you can feel a change under your skis. And mountain environments are actually full of perceptual cues, and you're constantly being bombarded by relevant signals. But here's the thing about perception, is that it doesn't actually happen in this nice, quiet, pristine environment. It happens against a really noisy backdrop. So all of the important perceptual information has the opportunity to get missed. So let's take a hot second to see what I mean by this, because when we look at all of the available perceptual cues, all of these auditory, tactile, visual cues, some of them come in really clear, some of them are momentary and then they disappear, others can be intermittent or scattered, and some can appear to be really important, but they might actually be insignificant. And then some of them, the terrain might be able to, or might block, or you might be looking somewhere else, or you might be digging through your pack and miss some of these perceptual cues. So greater knowledge about the nature of perception while we're out ski touring can help us answer that question of, how could they not have noticed the signs? So the second cognitive process is looking at attention. So we know the world is full of perceptual cues. We use these perceptual cues to actually focus our attention on some things and not on other things. So if you think of the last time you were at like a super loud party that was hopefully not too recent because social distancing, and you are like really focused on the person that's right in front of you and you're trying to strain to hear what they're saying, and then suddenly across the room you hear someone call your name. This is actually a great example of directed and divided attention and selective attention. You're directing your attention to the person in front of you, so you are focusing on the signals you're getting from them while excluding all the other signals surround you. But when your brain hears potentially meaningful or relevant cues like your name, it redirects your attention to be able to account for some of those. So what's meaningful and relevant is partially a function of what you know about the hazards that you're facing, your knowledge, and it's partly a function of your experience. And we'll talk a little bit about how mental models help with sort of forming these expectancies in a little bit. So as we talked about, world is full of distracting perceptual data, and this kind of splits your attention, but those around you can also capture your attention. So it's not just the information that's coming in from the world. If you're in, say, complex terrain, considerable hazard conditions, you're more likely to be appropriately directing your attention and watching for signals that the stability is changing than you are to be focused on whether the rookie you brought out with you is able to keep up with the group. So we selectively attend to different things. So what you remember is, not surprisingly, a function of what you've learned, and how you've learned is actually a big part of how useful that knowledge is when you are trying to actually, the rubber is actually trying to hit the road. So it's about, how do you store the knowledge Like, what relationships exist between the things that you know and that you don't know, and how can you recall that knowledge? So are you able to recognize when that knowledge is going to actually be useful and relevant? This is called activating your knowledge. So it's possible to take an avalanche course and be taught about the implications of terrain on propagation, but it's another thing to actually be out on the slope and be able to apply that knowledge. It needs to be complete, it needs to be correct, and it needs to be organized in a way that you can actually pull that out when you need it, relative to the types of cues that you are seeing. So we use all of these kinds of cognitive processes to actually reason about what's going on. Is it dangerous to ski that slope? Is it safe? How safe or how dangerous it is? And all of the reasoning is about bringing to bear new knowledge that's coming in, integrating that with your expectations of what you're about to find, being able to validate that relative to the knowledge that you have about the hazards, and then being able to form an action. And so decisions are not just a go, no go. You're often looking at options that are available to you relative to the capabilities of yourself and of your team, relative to the resources that you have available. How tired is everyone? How many explosives do you have left in your pack? What kinds of goals do you have? Are you trying to get an area open, or are you trying to, make the next ridge? And what kinds of priorities does your group have? So all of this is extra work, extra cognitive effort that goes into making decisions in these kinds of environments. And two often underappreciated aspects of making decisions in avalanche terrain have to do with managing competing priorities. As I mentioned, that guide who kind of has those clients wants to keep those clients happy, but also staying within that safety margin. And it's also about balancing the benefits versus the costs of the decisions. So I can understand it's late, your head might hurt. Why do we just talk about skiing? Why am I doing Cognitive Science 101 at an avalanche workshop? First of all, it's because the more that we learn about these different processes that are involved in that big label that we use for decision making, the more we're actually able to discern opportunities for where we could learn more or practice more or improve our decision making. It also gives us new ways to consider what happened during accidents. Was it really summit fever or expert halo, or was it difficulties in perceiving change? Can we look at a reasoning around a near miss that went into a decision and see the ways that incomplete or inaccurate knowledge might have contributed, so that we can go read more or take more classes about that specific kind of problem in the snowpack? So it gives us more specific ways to deal with breakdowns in the cognitive processes than just saying they fell into a heuristic trap. So I'm going to pause for 1 second here because I just realized I have a lovely video for you and I forgot to screen share. Let's do this. So Zoom has this lovely feature where they will make your video nice and laggy unless you tell them not to. So here we go. Let's do this again. All right. So this video to me is like one of the most salient ways that we can bring together all of this stuff that we just talked about cognition, about perception, seeing what's happening. What does that mean for my goals and priorities? How do I shift gears? And it gives us, and it's also a nice fun ski video. So what I want you to do is I want you to drop into the Q&A or drop into the chat some of the ways in which you might see some of these cognitive processes at play in this video. So some of you might be seeing right now that he's not seeing every single tree around him. He's not seeing every single rock. He's actually focused and selected his attention on the line that he is planning to take. He's adjusting and adapting relative to how he hits, you know, a little bump, how he hits the little kicker he's about to jump. And he's adapting in real time. He's making these rapid decisions. Am I set up properly for the backflip? Yes, I am. Let's go for it. So perception and the cognitive processes are actually happening in real time, and they're happening over at a very rapid rate of speed. So moving forward, when we start talking about, all right, what we just saw was like a really cool example of how anticipating what's coming next, seeing what's coming next, and then being able to anticipate, what does this mean for the line that I want to take? What does this mean for how I might need to shift my weight or my balance? All of this is representative of what has to happen when we're navigating risk in the real world as well. So it's kind of a subtle but non-trivial finding from the safety sciences that while good planning and preparations are important, there's always going to be a need to change that plan, sometimes in small ways and sometimes like really substantially. Therefore, being successful at managing risk in a dynamic environment is about being able to notice the changing conditions early, to anticipate their implications, and then to be able to adjust your performance accordingly. So a quote that's attributed to Eisenhower is that, in preparing for battle, I've always found that plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. And I know this can be a very contentious thing to say, so I want to be absolutely clear. I am not saying don't have a plan. What I'm saying is that the act of planning is what helps you form an expectation about what you're about to find. So this helps prime what kinds of knowledge you might need to bring to bear given the situation. It's going to direct your attention because you're looking for certain kinds of perceptual cues because you have an expectation of what's about to come. This can help you figure out what options are actually available to you. Can also help you recognize when things are changing. It violates your expectancy of what you thought you were going to find when you got out there. And all of this can set you up to very safely adapt. So I'm going to use a really simplified example here to make this a bit more concrete. So if you are trying to go somewhere, you have a plan. You make a plan about the route that you're going to take. But as you venture out, you might actually run into traffic. So you have to actually shift gears. You have to anticipate and adjust your actions in order to not get into an accident or in order to reach your destination. And you begin to anticipate how you need to adjust your speed to be able to still meet your goal, sometimes slowing down, sometimes speeding up. You might end up just turning right and adapting your plan entirely. So the more you are prepared, the more that you are able to adapt and adjust in real time, the more successful you're going to be at being able to manage risk. So this is a perfect transition to my next point, which is that knowing what to expect, being able to recognize when things are going to be different than you expected them to be, and having other potential options readily at hand, and then adjusting, is all relative to how well calibrated you are to the conditions. And so we talked a lot about cognitive processes, about this need to anticipate and adjust. And the research in other domains has shown that well-calibrated mental models, which is a person's internalized thought processes about how something works in the real world, can actually help you to be able to anticipate change and to adjust in real time. This is a real benefit when you're in an environment where conditions change really quickly. So the previous research in the avalanche community, dating like all the way back to the 1980s, has shown that avalanche professionals, the experts of this community, they often use mental models to develop simulations about the likelihoods of certain classes of problems and the potential implications of changing conditions so that they can adjust their control work. And one of the most interesting findings from some research that I recently conducted at a ski operation on the West Coast is that calibration of being able to continually validate that what you think is going on is actually going to go on, is actually one of the most defining characteristics of expertise in forecasting. What I saw was continual attempts of both direct and indirect actions that can help calibrate the expectation. This was examples of things like a forecaster who lived at sea level and installed a rain gauge on his deck so that he could anticipate how much snow was accumulating up top before he'd even finished his first cup of coffee. Sometimes some of the forecasters I'd talked to would wake up in the middle of the night and they would hear the wind on the roof, and they'd start thinking about how that was going to affect the snowpack up top. So all of these kinds of calibration points are efforts to continually ensure that your mental model is accurate so that the adjustments that you make and the ability to anticipate is well calibrated. So a second point that I wanted to make about calibrating mental models has to do with about the shared sort of and distributed nature of learning and of kind of perceiving the mountain environment. And so this is not necessarily a new thing. This is from the safety sciences, Wood's theorem, that says as the complexity of a situation increases, the accuracy of any one single person's model of that situation is going to decrease rapidly. But most AVI courses will tell you that it's important that everyone pitches in, that everyone sort of like voices their perspective. And I've been touring for about 20 years, and there's been many times where I've kind of trusted the judgment of my peers. I've not been super actively involved in decision making. But the more that I understand about how perception is not absolute, it's easy to miss things, even if you are well-intentioned, even if you are, trying really hard, about how difficult it can be to actually access knowledge when you're in the moment. And about how mental models are always going to be kind of partial and incomplete, even while you're continually updating them. The more I realize how important it is for us to, each of us to contribute to that discussion. So this is true for experts, this is true for recreationists, this is even true for you if you're a novice. Sometimes even asking the questions that something that seems really self-evident can help activate knowledge or help direct attention that maybe wasn't being considered in the moment. So this is a transition to my next and last point here, and one that Steve made quite nicely earlier. And that's about studying accidents is not actually enough. We also need to study when things go right. And I heard Scott ask a question about this earlier about, how do we do this? And from a cognitive systems engineering perspective, from a lot of the safety sciences perspective, there's a lot of techniques and a lot of methods that can help us understand what does normal work look like? What does it look like when we normally go out into the mountains? But there's also some more basic ways that you can do this within your own crews or within your own touring partners. And last week, Sarah talked about debriefing every damn time. And I love that because it's about reflecting on our experiences. It's about recognizing when our knowledge might not be accurate or complete. It's about continually assessing how well am I perceiving the environment? What kinds of things can I do to help improve my ability to see, improve my ability to understand the rate of change and the implications for my touring partner, my touring objectives. So it's about being open and being curious to critiques of your own actions and decisions. And it's being willing to point out when you feel uncomfortable about an action or decision, even though nothing happened. So the ways in which things go right are not necessarily just the inverse of how things go wrong. Trying to understand safety by studying accidents is kind of like trying to understand marriage by only studying divorce. So even initial research that myself and my co-author Jesse Percival did in studying how things go right we surfaced all sorts of really surprising and new ways to think about how do we train forecasters, how do we structure the system of work, how do we conduct handoffs across shifts, how do we encourage the use of multiple triangulating data sources to help us reimagine the ways in how we not only reduce errors, but increase insights. So these are 5 key concepts for a new way of staying safe that could be distilled into just one key takeaway. And it would be this, that human performance is so much more than how the avalanche community is currently defining human factors. And this conversation is part of a much broader conversation that I joined when I joined the academic community. And it's the conversation that I'm sharing with you all today in the hopes that we take our experiences of operating in these dynamic environments, whether we're new to them, whether we've been here for a while, whether this is our workplace, and we help to break new trail into reducing avalanche injuries and fatalities. Thanks so much. Please drop me a line if you have any questions or you want more reading.
Thank you so much, Laura. I really appreciate that discussion around how the role of planning can filter into kind of influencing some of our mental models and kind of thinking about how we calibrate. We often focus on the debrief, and while that's so important, the role of planning is also such a strong place to work from. Some other questions from the audience here. Eric Olson asks, what other reading and resources can you point us to?
Excellent, Eric. So a really good starting point, a book that's really accessible. It's not dry. It's got a lot of very practical suggestions, is the Field Guide to Understanding Human Error by Sidney Dekker, who Steve talked about a little bit earlier. If you are into a bit more of the safety nerd stuff, but you still want it really grounded in sort of practical learning, Behind Human Error by, well, there's a collection of folks, but Woods, Cook, Johannesson, Dekker, and Patterson is a great book. And there's a number of really accessible academic papers. So if you're into that, you can search a paper called How Complex Systems Fail, which is would be a nice sort of bridge if you were really keen on what Steve was talking about earlier about sort of thinking about systems and thinking about complexity, and some of what I was talking about here kind of would bridge that quite nicely. That would be a good starting point.
Great, thank you so much, Laura. My other coworkers are rapidly trying to drop some of those resources into the chat here, but we might ask you to follow up with some of those after the talk, that we can share it with the audience. Well, with that, I think that we will wrap up this evening. Thank you so much, Laura, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.